have already created a new Foursquare application, which allowed us to create a client ID and a client secret values. These we mentioned are going to be very useful when we create the URL that will allow us to make requests to the endpoint that we're going to be using. We have also explored a little bit the JSON that this endpoint is going to be returning, so we know a little bit more about what we are going to be able to get by requesting information from this Foursquare API. And we mentioned that this URL is going to be slightly different because we are not going to be using an OAuth token. We learned that we can use, instead of an OAuth token, the client ID and the client secret that we just created to authenticate userlessly. So what we're going to do now is copy this link that we found in the userless authentication section. The URL, by the way, for this section is linked in the resources for the lecture. And we're going to be using this URL on Visual Studio with actual values. So we're going to be learning how to create this URL now so we can get it ready to start requesting things to the Foursquare API. So back in Visual Studio, currently we have some pages inside of the portable class library, and we already have a model. What I want to do is create another folder. And inside of this folder, which I'm going to call helpers, I am going to add a new class. And this new class is going to be called constants. So inside of this class, we're going to have variables that don't ever change values. First, this is going to be a public class. And inside of this public class, I'm going to have a public const to define as constant, a string, which is going to be the type of the variable, and it's going to be venue underscore search. And I'm going to assign a value, which is going to be the URL that we just found. But what I want to do is change the value for the latitude and longitude. Instead of establishing right away, what I have to do is add some brackets like this and add a number inside. And I will explain about this in just a second. I will just start with 0, then 1. Then I'm going to need the 2 for the client ID. So I'm going to do curly brackets, a 2 inside of some curly brackets. The same for the client secret, which is now 3. And finally a 4 for the year or the version. So first let's explain about the constant. I am defining this variable as constant, which means it won't be able to change its value. Then by convention, I'm establishing its name to be in capital letters. This is just the general convention when it comes to defining constant variables. And then I'm assigning a string, but I changed the values that were inside of that string to something that may be a little bit off. I am adding some curly brackets and I'm adding a number inside of this. What I'm really doing in here is setting placeholders for values. When we create the string, we're going to be formatting this string. And so after passing the main string, we can start passing the values that are going to be inside of these placeholders that I have just added. For example, the first value that I pass is going to be set in the first placeholder, which is going to be the one for the latitude. The second value that I pass is going to be inside of the second placeholder, and so on and so forth. So now that we have this constant variable, I am going to save the changes, and I'm going to navigate to the model folder. Inside here, I am going to need yet another class. And this class is going to be the venue class. Now, right now, we don't really know what a venue is going to look like. We only saw a little bit about it on the API Explorer in the form of a JSON. But what we can do is from this venue class, which I'm going to be making public, by the way, create the URL that we're going to need. So inside here, I will add a public static void generate URL method, which is going to require a float for the latitude. Actually, let's make this double. A double is going to be very similar to a float, except it can have twice as many decimal points. And the reason why I'm using double is because I believe that's the type in which we're getting the latitude and longitude information. So I'll just request it that way so we don't have to do any casting. And it's also going to be requesting a double for the longitude. And in the body of this method is where we want to generate that URL. So I am going to create a string URL, which is going to be equal to string.format, which is going to be the method that allows us to format a string. And first we need the string to which we are going to apply the format. In this case, we can get it from constants. To be able to use the constant class, we need to add a using directive to its namespace. And constants is going to have venue search. And then after a comma is where we can start passing all of these values. So we can pass first the latitude, then the longitude. And if we remember, the next values are going to be first the client ID, then the client secret, and finally the version. Now for the client ID and the client secret, I'm going to navigate back to the Foursquare application in my browser. So here I am on my Foursquare application, where I can actually copy the client ID and the client secret to use them back on Visual Studio. And actually, it's a good idea to copy them and paste them as constants, because these are also not going to be changing. So I am back here in Visual Studio, where I have already added a constant with my client ID and a constant with my client secret. And so back in the getURL method, after the longitude, I can pass constant.clientID, then constants.clientSecret, and then this is the tricky one. This is the date, but it has a specific format. It has 4 digits for the year, 2 digits for the month, and 2 digits for the day. What we have to do is first get the date, which we can get through datetime.now. And this is already going to have today's date. And after this, I can call the toString method, which, if you remember, comes directly from the object class. And this toString method is going to require the format that I'm going to set. In here is where I want to pass a string, which has to be 4 Ys for the year, then 2 capital M's for the month, then 2 V's for the day, which is the format that Foursquare is requiring. And so we now have the method that is going to be generating that URL. But now that I think of this, we probably want this to be a string, and so we probably want to return this string that we have just built. And so we have a URL ready to start requesting information to the Foursquare venue search endpoint. It's going to send latitude and longitude, in this case the ones that we pass, which are probably going to be the user's location. Then it's going to use our client ID and our client secret, which are constant values. And then we're going to pass today's date with a certain format, which is going to be the one required by Foursquare. And so now that we have this, in the next lecture, we're going to prepare our project to be able to connect to the internet to make that request.